Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining.
In the Senate, they called it the United in Strengthening America Act. And in the House, they called it the Patriot Act, providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorist acts. And the compromise was to call it both, the USA Patriot Act. But the real purpose behind those names, of course, was to suggest that anyone who would criticize it is unpatriotic, is a traitor.
To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists.
People were essentially presumed guilty until determined to be innocent.
The arrests were considered secret, and the detainees were allowed little contact with the outside world. They were held for months, even though they had broken no criminal laws.
The government was giving us kind of a running tally.
There have been a total of over 480 people arrested or detained. 614 persons. Detained nearly 1,000 individuals.
He swept broadly, he swept blindly, until the number was over 1,000, and people started asking questions. They said, how many of these 1,000 people have been charged with the crimes of September 11th? And the answer was 0. Then people asked, well, how many of these people, these suspected terrorists, have been charged with any crime related to terrorism? And the answer was 0.
President Bush said as recently as this week, the United States does not torture detainees.
That's not an accurate statement.
The editorial in the Washington Post today summarized what the paper believes the administration wants to do by changing the law. Let me read part of this thing. It wants to authorize, or wants authorization for the CIA to hide detainees in overseas prisons where even the International Committee of the Red Cross won't have access. It wants permission to interrogate those detainees with abusive practices that in the past have included induced hypothermia and waterboarding or simulated drowning. And it wants the right to try such detainees and perhaps sentence them to death on the basis of evidence that the defendants cannot see and that may have been extracted during those abusive interrogation sessions.
The House just passed President Bush's bill to redefine the treatment of detainees, and the Senate's expected to do the same thing tomorrow. Buried deep inside this legislation is a provision that will pardon President Bush and all the members of his administration of any possible crimes connected with the torture and mistreatment of detainees, dated all the way back to September 11, 2001.
You can make your own definition of torture and say we don't violate it.
But from your definition, you believe the United States, under this administration, has used torture.
I don't think it. I know it.
At least President Nixon had Gerald Ford to do his dirty work. President Bush is trying to pardon himself. Here's the deal. Under the War Crimes Act, violations of the Geneva Conventions are felonies, in some cases punishable by death. When the Supreme Court ruled the Geneva Conventions applied to Al-Qaeda and Taliban detainees, President Bush and his boys were suddenly in big trouble. They've been working these prisoners over pretty good. In an effort to avoid possible prosecution, they're trying to cram this bill through Congress before the end of the week when Congress adjourns.
The wartime argument that always comes back in these kind of debates about presidential powers. What's the history on that in terms of the Constitution and the presidents? Have presidents who have been seem to have stretched the Constitution, have they been investigated in wartime, even under the much stricter definitions of wartime we used to have?
Well, first of all, this president's theory of his power is now, I think, so extreme that it's unprecedented. He believes that he has the inherent authority to violate federal law. He has said that, not just in signing statements. In the infamous torture memo that Alberto Gonzales signed, it was stated that he could, in some circumstances, order federal officials to violate federal law.
Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own.
It could last, 6 days, 6 weeks. I doubt 6 months.
By the numbers, Iraq has been a story of contrast. At first, 3 weeks of the planet's most powerful military sweeping up Saddam Hussein's army.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended.
Those were promising days.
I do know that a lot of innocent people have died, and that troubles me, and it grieves me. And I applaud the Iraqis for their courage in the face of violence. I am amazed that this is a society which so wants to be free that they're willing to, that there's level of violence that they tolerate. And it's now time for the Iraqi government to work hard to bring security in neighborhoods so people can feel at peace.
30,000, Mr. President. Do you stand by your figure, 30,000?
I stand by the figure. A lot of innocent people have lost their life. 600,000, whatever they guessed at, it's not credible. Thank you.
Now, almost 4 years later, with 3,000 U.S. service members almost killed, 20,000 U.S. service members seriously wounded, the total cost of the war in Iraq will be close to $500 billion so far. And there are a lot of people who'd love to know exactly what it is we have bought with all that money, besides grief and bloodshed as far as the eye can see.
This is Fantasyland. We're talking about ending the war. My God, we're just starting a war right today. There was a vote in the Senate today. Joe Lieberman, who authored the Iraq resolution, has offered another resolution, and it is essentially a fig leaf to let George Bush go to war with Iran. And I'm ashamed of you, Hillary, for voting for it. You're not going to get another shot at this, because what's happened, if this war ensues, we invade, and they're looking for an excuse to do it. And Obama was not even there to vote.
Senator Clint, I want to give you a chance to respond.
You get the sense that the country is desperate for someone to show us the way. Not the old way, not the same way, but a new way.
Everybody on this stage, we are all united, Wolf. We all believe that we need to try to end this war. In 2 nights, you're going to have the Republican candidates here. They all support the war. They all support the president. They all supported the escalation. Each of us is trying in our own way to bring the war to an end.
Well, let's face it. I mean, all of the college Democrats, we're still behind just winning a Democrat in 2008. If you look at all the Republican candidates, I mean, the Democrats are such a diverse group, and all the Republican candidates, every one of them has said that they would commute Scooter Libby. They said that, they would stay in Iraq and turn it into the next Korea.
Will you pledge that by January 2013, the end of your first term, more than 5 years from now, there will be no U.S. troops in Iraq?
I don't want to make promises not knowing what the situation is going to be 3 or 4 years out.
I agree with Barack. It is very difficult to know what we're going to be inheriting.
I cannot make that commitment.
Think about this for a minute. What if we pulled all of our troops out of South Korea? They've been there for 50 years, tens of thousands of them. What if we quit worrying about Iran and instead realized that its having a nuclear weapon isn't the end of the world? What if we pulled all our troops out of Iraq, brought them all home? What if we realistically addressed the debt and paid attention to the huge burden we're placing on generations to come? Guess whose ideas these are? And you hardly ever hear his name. This is Republican candidate Ron Paul.
Congressman Paul, you voted against the war. Why are all your fellow Republicans up here wrong?
That's a very good question, and you might ask the question, why are 70% of the American people now wanting us out of there?
Let's start with Laura Elizabeth Morales. You go ahead and give us your thoughts. Who's going to be the Republican nominee if you had to be a betting woman this morning?
Sure. If I had to be a betting woman and I had to be idealistic, I'd really like to see Ron Paul get the nomination for the Republican Party.
Whoa! But it brings me to the other question. Is there any likely, let's say,
what are you trying to say?
Top-tier GOP candidate? Because if I was a betting woman, I'd say Ron Paul doesn't have a chance, unfortunately, for you.
What's success for you in this campaign? What's success? Well, to win is one is the goal. That's not going to happen. You know, absolutely. You want to bet your every cent in your pocket for that? Yes, you are. Okay.
You're basically saying that we should take our marching orders from Al-Qaeda. If they want us off the Arabian Peninsula, we should leave.
No! I'm saying we should take our marching orders from our Constitution. We should not go to war. We should not go to war without a declaration. We should not go to war when it's an aggressive war. This is an aggressive invasion. We've committed the invasion of this war, and it's illegal under international law. That's where I take my marching orders, not from any enemy.
Over this way.
Paul has raised as much money as McCain now, and they don't know what Ron Paul's going to do with that money because he's not going to get the nomination.
I like Ron Paul, and I'm not a Republican Democrat. I just happen to like his message.
Guy Ron Paul, who has no chance of winning it, and therefore he was very honest, and he's my new hero.
#1 fundraiser from military personnel. Congressman Ron Paul of the 14th Congressional District of Texas.
32% sending in money to Ron Paul, 22% for John McCain.
Paul, this Republican presidential candidate, raising within 24 hours $4.2 million. It's an amazing sum of money. I don't remember someone doing that out on the campaign trail. What do you make of this?
Well, and the source of the money is to me what's interesting. He got it from 35,000 comparatively small contributors. And once again, we got this huge outpouring of support. It's unlike the support that I get on the email, through the email of any of the other presidential candidates. But I wonder if this ability to raise this kind of money in this short a period of time, and the fact that we're sitting here now talking about it for the third or fourth time this afternoon, might be the launching pad that he's been looking for.
Why are we determined to follow a foreign policy of empire building and preemption which is unbecoming of a constitutional republic? It's important to recall that the left in 2003 offered little opposition to the preemptive war in Iraq, and many are now not willing to stop it by defunding it or work to prevent an attack on Iran. The catch-all phrase, the war on terrorism, in all honesty, has no more meaning than if one wants to wage a war against criminal gangsterism. Terrorism is a tactic. You can't have a war against a tactic. It's deliberately vague and non-definable in order to justify and permit perpetual war anywhere and under any circumstances. Don't forget, the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with any terrorist attack against us, including that on 9/11. Special interests and the demented philosophy of conquest have driven most wars throughout all of history. Rarely has the cause of liberty, as it was in our own revolution, been the driving force. In recent decades, our policies have been driven by neoconservative empire radicalism, profiteering in the military-industrial complex, misplaced do-good internationalism, mercantilistic notions regarding the need to control natural resources, and blind loyalty to various governments in the Middle East. For all the misinformation given the American people to justify our invasion, such as our need for national security, enforcing UN resolutions, removing a dictator, establishing a democracy, protecting our oil, the argument has been reduced to this: if we leave now, Iraq will be left in a mess, implying the implausible that if we stay, it won't be a mess. Since it could go badly when we leave, that blame must be placed on those who took us there, not on those of us who now insist that Americans no longer need be killed or maimed, and that Americans no longer need to kill any more Iraqis. We've had enough of both.